and on the other hand, Baxter, Novartis and GSK have filed patents for the vaccines a couple of years before.
Nameće se zaključak, a to i vi spominjete u vašim kaznenim prijavama, a vidimo i stvari koje vode u tom smjeru, da je riječ o nekakvom planu za obvezno cijepljenje svih ljudi. To kod nas nije toliko izraženo, u Americi malo više. Općenito Svjetska zdravstvena organizacija uvijek daje neke preporuke, što zvuči blago. Međutim, naravno, odluke Svjetske zdravstvene organizacije su obvezujuće za njenih gotovo 200 zemalja članica. Kad se jednom proglasi pandemija, kao što jest proglašena, to znači da oni zapravo mogu odrediti da li cjepivo obavezno ili nije. Kako se razvija taj plan o obaveznom cijepljenju? Kako se razvija u različitim zemljama? Gdje se provodi, gdje je bliže cilju, gdje je još daleko od toga?
Well, we can see how it works now in the Ukraine, not very far from Croatia, and just last week plague was reported, which allegedly killed a lot of people, and within a very short space of time, the president of the Ukraine, Viktor Yushchenko, said this is a national emergency. He was going to implement special measures to deal with it and suspend elections or postpone elections or whatever, and put quarantines around large regions. And he also said he was going to prepare to vaccinate the entire population. So within the Ukraine, there have been laws put in place which allow this kind of forced vaccination, forced quarantine to take place. And these laws have been put in place by the World Health Organization, and they're actually the International Health Regulations 2005 that are now being implemented in the Ukraine. A crisis committee has been set up, and this takes over control of key government functions in the Ukraine, also the police and the health services. So that's how easily it can happen. They just have to find an excuse to declare there's a big pandemic, and then they can start implementing all this legislation, which is on the books anyway. The same is true of the USA. A couple of weeks ago, President Obama declared a national emergency over the swine flu pandemic, and by doing this he activated certain laws which will also enable the federal government and states to implement forced vaccination and forced quarantine eventually if they think they can get away with it.
Što ti zakoni doista omogućuju, kako u Americi, tako i u Engleskoj i u Francuskoj? Riječ je o mjerama koje na prvi pogled zvuče kao mjere policijske države, možda i na drugi. Znači, stanovništvo se može cijepiti bez vlastite želje, može se ulaziti u privatne posjede, uhititi svakoga tko ne želi se cijepiti. Kazno $1000 se spominju. Čak se ide u ekstreme, pa se spominje da čovjek neće moći dignuti svoj novac u banci ako nema potvrdu da je cijepljen. Je li to sve točno? Postoje li takvi primjeri? Ja sam ih skupio dosta po internetu. Neki se tiču nekih država, američkih kao Massachusetts, neke se tiču evropskih država, poput Francuske. Dajte nam nekoliko primjera u kom smjeru i kako to ide negdje drugdje.
Yes, I mean, you mentioned Massachusetts, which has particularly draconian laws. Under the Massachusetts pandemic emergency declaration, the police can force vaccinate children. They can go into people's homes, and they can even burn homes and quarantine whole towns. They can send people to FEMA camps, I suppose, on the grounds that they could be infected with the swine flu. And people can be put in this quarantine indefinitely without access to the outside world. So basically, it's incredibly drastic measures that are in place, as well as enormous fines, I think. France is also kind of planning a situation where France ends up divided into military zones and coming under the control of army officials in the event of a pandemic emergency who can suspend basic civic rights. The Minister of Justice has said people can be kept in prison for 6 months without trial in the event of a pandemic emergency. Children can be put on trial in adults' courts. So wherever you look, whether it's the USA, examples like Massachusetts, or whether it's Europe and France or whatever, you see that the pandemic is being used as an excuse to deprive people of their most basic civic rights. Yes.
Kada pričamo o posljedicama cjepiva, Inače, na vašem sajtu Swine Flu postoji ogromna količina tekstova i članaka koje svaki dan obnavljate i updatirate. Da li se može govoriti da su se već dogodile neke smrti koje su posljedica cjepiva, s obzirom da također postoje nekakve indicije da takva cjepiva koja rade u 3 koraka zapravo ne donose smrt odmah? U prvom koraku, ako sam dobro shvatio, se imunološki sustav ugasi, u drugom se cjepivo ubrizga, u trećem onda imunološki sustav svojom pretjeranom reakcijom zapravo ubija čovjeka, jer ne bi baš bilo jako efikasno cijepiti ljude dok drugi okolo umiru. Međutim, da li prema vašim podacima postoje već neke smrti od cijepiva dokumentirane?
Yes, if we look at Sweden, at least 5 people have been reported to have died shortly after they took the swine flu shot by the mainstream media alone. And 160, I think, nurses had severe reactions in Sweden, and those are just the cases that were reported in the mainstream media. Bear in mind, the Swedish government doesn't require doctors to report deaths or damage caused by the swine flu. We also don't know how many people in Sweden have actually taken the swine flu shot, because the government only reports how many doses have been distributed, which is 1.4 million. There's no figures about how many people have actually taken the shot. So we can see in Sweden people who have died as a result of this jab already. You were referring at first to the WHO memos of 1972, which were uncovered by Patrick Jordan and Dr. Rebecca Carley in the USA, and they found that the World Health Organization, even back then, was thinking of using vaccines to kill people, and had developed a method which we now can see being realized in the swine flu vaccine, as you just described it.
Da li je bilo primjera svinjske gripe u nedavnoj prošlosti, prije 20, 30, 50, 80 godina? Postoje nekakve čak i teorije da je poznata gripa iz 1918. u stvari poslužila kao predložak za virus o kojem se danas toliko priča, i o cjepivu.
That's what I understand too. I understand that Jeffrey Taubenberger, a US scientist who works for the Army Institute of Pathology in Maryland, went and dug up the corpse of a victim of the Spanish pandemic flu. And this victim was preserved in the permafrost of Alaska, and he and his team extracted the genetic material, took it back to their lab, and began trying to reconstruct it. And every time they successfully took a step towards reconstructing this virulent virus, they actually published the results in scientific journals. So and that's how they reconstructed the H1N1 virus, and also the bird flu virus is an artificial lab-engineered virus. There's another case of French professor Bruno Lina, who has gone on record in the French media this summer as saying he's looking for a more virulent gene for the swine flu virus in his laboratory in Lyon. So there are plenty of these researchers and scientists working on making these viruses more and more virulent and turning them into really deadly weapons.
Možete li nam možda još jednom detaljnije objasniti što zapravo cjepivo protiv svinjske gripe u sebi sadrži? Koje sve viruse ili nešto što bi moglo djelovati pogubno?
Well, in theory it's supposed to contain the swine flu virus, whatever that might be, but the problem is that basically WHO can, and the pharmaceutical companies can put any virus into this vaccine. What we have found is that there are no controls at all on this vaccine. The Polish health minister herself said recently, we don't know what's in this vaccine. Anything could be in it because it's kept secret under commercial secrets. The companies themselves admit that mercury is in it, and mercury has caused autism in children, and squalene is in it, and live virus is in it, though we can't be sure really what live virus is in it. The secret contract that the French government sealed with Baxter was eventually published just a couple of weeks ago, and it turned out that Baxter had a contract to supply 150 vaccines for meningitis in the event of a pandemic. So there could even be meningitis viruses causing damage.